Hi, I'm Matt Wooler, a professor here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and co-lead author of Lifetime Mobility of an Arctic Woolly Mammoth, published in Science. Let's hear about our mammoth and how we studied where it moved.
The tusk that we used as the primary object for this study was collected in northern Alaska on what we call the North Slope between the Brooks Range and the Arctic Ocean. And it was collected along a river that drains from the Brooks Range to the Arctic Ocean. And this particular tusk also was actually part of a partial skeleton of a mammoth. And the tusk itself, once it was collected, was brought to the University of Alaska Museum of the North here in Fairbanks. And our museum is a repository. It's a federal repository for federal collections made here in Alaska.
We used a laser ablation multi-collector inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer to measure the strontium isotopes along the entire length of the mammoth's tusk. Strontium isotopes are related to the local geology and can tell us about where the mammoth was living. This technique generated over 400,000 data points, and for help with all this data, we turned to Thomas Prohaska and Johanna Irrgeher at the University of Leoben in Austria.
So it was actually back in 2018 that I got a mail from Matt for a request to support him and his lab crew for setting up a laboratory for strontium isotope measurements.
We've been in contact with the team in Fairbanks ever since to discuss on the method and also on the data evaluation. And we also received some samples here in Leoben to cross-validate the data based on independent measurements. We're very happy about this collaboration and the entire team. The collaboration has been tremendous.
And it really shows that analytical chemistry can be so much fun.
I'm an expert on tooth formation, and so the team asked me if I could determine how old our mammoth was, and also if it'd be possible to figure out how much time was elapsed between each of the isotopic samples they took. And so I went and examined the tusks up in Alaska, and there were growth bands on the outside that we know in modern elephants represent annual growth. And so from those rings, we determined that this animal was about 28 years of age when it died. And then what I asked was for some of the samples of the tusk, little tiny pieces of a giant tooth, and they'd done their isotopic sampling along here. And so from these, I went ahead and made microscopic slides, and I could look inside the tooth. And at a microscopic level, you can actually pick up daily bands. So as a tooth forms, a daily mineralization front occurs, and they're called von Ebner's incremental lines. And you can see them right here, going across. And from those, and then the widths between where the samples were taken, I could determine that we were looking at a week's time with regard to each of the isotopic samples.
We received a small bit of bone and tusk from UAF, which we took to our clean lab here at University of California, Santa Cruz, where we extracted ancient DNA and turned that into genomic sequencing libraries.
We sequenced the libraries and we were able to say that the mammoth was a male and that it was a member of the last living clade of mammoths in Alaska.
Hello, I'm Clement Bataille from the University of Ottawa, and I'm a co-lead author on this study. I've worked with Amy Willis at the University of Washington to develop sophisticated modeling technique to reconstruct the entire life history of this individual. So that's 28 years of mammoth's life at weekly resolution. But this mammoth lived 17,000 years ago. So that's pretty incredible to be able to do that. So how do we do it? Our model incorporates information about the mammoth and about the landscape on which he roamed. For example, we know the place of death of this mammoth individual because this is where we find the tusk. We also know that as the mammoth is roaming on the landscape, it incorporates chemical signals that we call isotopes into its tusk. And these chemical signals is telling us something about the provenance of this mammoth. So all those years later, measuring isotopes in the tusk, we can reconstruct, like a paleo GPS, the entire life history of this individual.
Our model starts by determining where the mammoth likely was a week before his death. We looked for a location in Alaska with an isotope signal that matches the isotope signal at the very base of his tusk. There are actually lots of places in Alaska with a similar isotope signal. But the mammoth probably couldn't have traveled hundreds of kilometers in a week. He probably couldn't have climbed up sheer cliff faces, and he probably didn't traverse glaciers. Therefore, we constrained our search to a radius of locations near the mammoth's place of death that didn't involve too much cliff jumping or glacial traverses.
Because many locations fit that criteria, we randomly picked one, with better matching location having a higher probability to be selected. So now we know where the mammoth was 1 week prior to its death. And we use that point as an anchor point to try to identify where the mammoth was 2 weeks prior to its death. Repeating the entire same process, but this time using the isotope signal just next to the base of the tusk. And we repeated this process again and again, stepping through the tusk to reconstruct the entire life history of the mammoth. To average out the randomness of this whole process, we did that thousands and thousands of times, reconstructing many possible walks of the life history of this mammoth.
At the end of this modeling process, we had about 5,000 highly plausible walks. Analyzing the walks, we can see consistent patterns. This includes areas that he frequented year after year, seasonal north-south mobility, and his level of mobility changing as he settled into middle age. Because we saw these signals across many walks, we can conclude these patterns with high confidence.
The exact nature of mammoth-human interactions remains tantalizingly ambiguous. Early peoples of Beringia may have only scavenged tusks from dead mammoths and never hunted them at all, or they could have specialized in megafaunal predation, including mammoths, using highly effective long-range weapons like atlatl darts. It's an open question. Our data addresses this in a number of ways. First, we see regular north-south movements between interior lowlands and the Brooks Range, North Slope. This seasonal movement appears to mirror caribou migration patterns, and we know that modern caribou were the primary large game targeted by Holocene hunters. The more predictable the mammoth movements, the more attractive they would be to early hunters. Second, the areas used by this mammoth are the areas preferentially used by the earliest Beringians, suggesting the habitat favored both species. Finally, our data suggests that as mammoth habitat was reduced at the end of the Ice Age, this would put stress on mammoth mobility, rendering them more vulnerable to predation and possible overpredation by humans.
The past provides important clues about natural experiments conducted over long periods of time. The eventual extinction of mammoths took place after substantial warming and environmental changes after the end of the last Ice Age. Our work shines a light on existing animals that live in the Arctic today and concerns over how they might have to alter their behavior, ranges, and movement patterns in response to the unprecedented warming and environmental changes taking place in the Arctic today.